letting us know what you do at the Directorate and how that is something that young people here should be interested in, and persuade them as why it's something worthy to keep alive and
Okay, first of all, I want to congratulate the Raíces organizers for having the courage and the masochism to invite me one more time to speak before them. The young people who put up with me that much are probably my family and my parents, my wife, and I guess Raíces is part of my family. You also put up with me all these years, so thank you for inviting me again. What is Directorate? The Cuban Democratic Directorate was founded in 1990, and our goal from day one, and was founded at a youth congress, very similar to this. Our goal from day one was to get in touch with, to identify those individuals, those early embryonic organizations that were emerging in Cuba at that time, who were trying to create an independent activity outside of the control of the state. No matter where they were, or what they said their ideology was, the fact that they were trying to organize themselves independently, and they were recuperating a sense of independent civil society within the existence of a dictatorship, like a Cuban dictatorship, was for us a very worthy thing which needed support. And our strategy was geared at identifying these groups and at providing whatever help we could provide in terms of logistics, in terms of information, but furthermore, of connecting these emerging organizations, these many times courageous individuals, with their counterparts outside of the United States. And one of the things that we did from very early on was to go to Europe, to go to Latin America, and find civil society organizations that were willing to link up with people in Cuba who were organizing and who were carrying out activities in certain areas that were compatible with their counterparts in other countries outside Cuba. And we found that once we went to Latin America, we went to Europe, and we got beyond the U.S.-Cuba stereotypes and beyond the embargo and anti-embargo debate, and we spoke about people in Cuba who were trying peacefully to create a new society, a new democratic and plural society through their nonviolent efforts in diverse areas. We found a lot of people willing to listen and willing to get in touch and willing to connect with their counterparts inside Cuba. And we also found a lot of people in the exile community in those early years of the emergence of civil society in Cuba who were willing also to get involved and support people in Cuba who were organizing on their own. And at that moment in time, it was a new type of effort. It was a new type of struggle that was beginning, at least for Cubans. We were greatly inspired by what had happened recently back then in Central and Eastern Europe, and also by the conscience, the deep awareness that the way to bring about democracy in Cuba was precisely by building a democratic society from within. Through all these years, we have been witnesses to the growth of that movement. We have been witnesses to how a very deep Cuba has been reawakening inside the island. And that awakening has also touched us here. Because another thing that you discover in this effort to connect with Cuba is that Cuba exists far beyond her borders. Cuba traditionally has generated such an intense social and political life that it has overcome its natural frontiers and has spread out to all the areas in its vicinity. And we saw from very early on how in the exile community, people of our generation and also younger, like you, would connect. We're willing to connect with what was going on inside Cuba. That movement today, when we first began, the civil society movement in Cuba were a few dozen people based mostly in Havana. Today it is a movement that has thousands of activists. Persecuted, repressed, many times in prison, but they're still there, they're still active, they're still struggling, they're still creating new means of trying to build a democratic society in Cuba. Back then they had very little recognition, today they have a lot more recognition internationally. And we've seen new leaderships also develop within that movement, and new perspectives. And we've seen the movement grow into the provinces. And in some provinces, some of the provinces in Cuba, like Villa Clara, like Matanzas, are the heart of the movement in terms of the amount of activities they carry out, and also in terms of what they're trying to do for their fellow Cubans. I believe that we have connected with Cuba by connecting with these Cubans in the island who are struggling for democratic change. I believe that these individuals, these compatriots of ours in Cuba who are struggling for change, and those who help them from the outside, whether we're Cuban or non-Cuban, form one great community which is trying to bring about the construction of a democratic society inside the island. I think that whatever the debates may be, the good medicine, the sure path to build a new Cuba, a Cuba where where the freedom of the individual will be respected by the government and by the laws, is precisely to work with those who have the courage to, from within Cuba, build this democratic alternative. But I think that the work of the democratic resistance in Cuba is very worthy, but it needs a great deal of support. It's part of a greater process. A greater process not just of us connecting with Cuba, but of Cuba connecting with itself. One of the things which has happened to Cuba is that it has suffered from a very rare type of political disease, which is very grave. Its consequences are monstrous, but it's occurred relatively few times in human history, basically in the 20th century. That disease is called totalitarianism. Cuba has been one of the 4 countries in the 20th century that suffered a totalitarian revolution. And part of the effects of totalitarianism is to fragment the nation, to divide it from itself, to weaken the social bonds and the historical bonds that bring that nation together. So part of our task is not just to connect with the Cubans in Cuba now, not just to connect with Cuba's present now, but to help bring about a more profound connection of Cuba's soul with itself. And that too is part of what Raíces can do. When you think that here in Miami we have a cemetery about 10 minutes away, 15 minutes away, where 3 Cuban presidents are buried, here in Miami. When we think that there's important bits and pieces of Cuban history in Tampa and Key West, in museums and private homes outside of Cuba, they're not inside the island, and that they have no way of connecting with each other, and the task of connection becomes even more challenging. And our goal is not just to connect with those who struggle for liberty and democracy inside Cuba now, but also to bring about a greater connection of the different islands that make up Cuba and which are scattered right now, so as to once again attempt to build a democratic nation. And in essence, that is what we do, that is our ideal, that is our goal, and that is the philosophy of what we're trying to pursue.